Hello, this is Gabriel. Welcome to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I'm here speaking in my office at the University of Notre Dame. And here is a video and a discussion with Professor Stephen Barr of the University of Delaware, a particle physicist. I speak about two topics which I find completely intriguing. I hope you will find the conversation also intriguing. The first topic is the question of whether there is intelligent life outside of this planet. Steve would say rational life is maybe the proper term, and what possible religious or theological implications that might have. The second topic is the question of whether on this planet humans have in fact free will, and what does science say about that? Are we just in fact machines of meat, as one saying puts it, or do we actually have an impact on the world around us through our mind? Thank you so much for joining for this conversation. I'll be really, really grateful if you take a moment to subscribe to this channel and also to like this video. That really encourages me to go on producing content. Thank you so much. Hello, Steve Barr. I'm really grateful to have another chance to speak with you.
Well, I enjoy these shows. I'm glad to be on again.
Thank you. So this YouTube channel is most conversations here are about the Quran and the Bible, and I do a lot of textual conversations about nitty-gritty of the Arabic of the Quran or the Hebrew or the Greek of the Bible. And I'm so grateful to have a change of pace. Not that I don't like that, to have a change of pace and to be able to speak a little science and religion. So yeah, this is really terrific. I'm going to read a brief introduction, which doesn't do justice to your history of work on both questions of just strict science and questions of science and religion. And then our topics for today are to speak about intelligent life elsewhere in the universe and questions or debates around free will and determinism. So everyone, Professor Stephen Barr is president of the Society of Catholic Scientists and Professor Emeritus of Theoretical Particle Physics at the University of Delaware. His research has centered mainly on grand unified theories and the cosmology of the early universe. In 2011, he was elected to be a fellow of the American Physical Society, quote, for his original contributions to grand unification, CP violation, and baryogenesis. He writes and lectures extensively on the relation of science and religion and is the author of this book, which had a huge impact on me. I mean, this was like one of the most formative books that I've read in the past 5 or 6 years. So I really encourage, if you haven't read it, friends, that you do so. Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, which was published by University of Notre Dame Press in 2003, almost 20 years ago now. And The Believing Scientist, Essays on Science and Religion, published by Erdmanns in 2016. He was elected in 2010 to the Academy of Catholic Theology and was awarded the Benemerenti Medal by Pope Benedict XVI. So is that okay as an introduction? Would you add anything? Or
no, that's fine.
Okay, super.
I'm married. I have 5 adult children, and other than that,
Yeah, well, that's a most impressive accomplishment, I would say, of all. Yeah, so Steve, in the last video we spoke about evolution and the Big Bang, and I'd be happy to go back to those subjects again because I don't think we exhausted them. I mean, if that even were possible. But I would like to cover the question of intelligent life and free will in this conversation, starting with intelligent life. And maybe we can begin with some of the basics for considering this question. And then we're going to get into some other things like UFO sightings and things like that eventually. But we'll start with the basics. So, I mean, how does a scientist think about what is necessary for life to exist on another planet? I remember hearing some podcast, I think, that liquid water, because of the way it acts as a locus or context where different chemicals can mix, is important. So is that right? And what else is necessary for life to exist?
well, that's an interesting question. I think, and I should emphasize, I'm a particle physicist and not an astrobiologist, so that's it's not my field of research, but I have heard talks on this. It's generally thought that liquid water is very important, and that having organic molecules, which have hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, and so forth, is very important. But there may be other things that there have been claims that there are a lot of conditions that you need to be satisfied, to have satisfied in order to have life appear. And so there may be things that there may be other conditions as well. People are generally, you need to have a planet where the gravity isn't too strong, otherwise it would crush everything. You need to have an atmosphere. You need to have the right kind of atmosphere. There are probably many conditions, and we may not know all of them.
So when we think of the actual search for intelligent life or life generally, maybe we'll just start with life generally. I hear people speak about finding Earth-like planets. And gosh, I think it was one of my kids who spoke to me about the zone, the orbit,
The habitable zone.
habitable zone. So not too close to the star, not too far away.
Right.
And now, maybe you could give us a rough idea about the size of the universe, at least the known universe,
right?
And the number of possible galaxies. Maybe it's impossible to actually give a number for possible solar systems. And then, I mean, is there any way to calculate how many Earth-like planets there might be?
Okay, actually, we can say something about that. So first of all, back to the habitable zone. So that idea is that, as you said, that the orbit of a planet's too close to the star, it'll be too hot, and you won't have liquid water. It'll be vaporized. If it's too far away, it'll be frozen. And so there's a sweet spot. There's a range of distances from the star. Now, we used to not know about any planets other than the ones in our solar system. And so there was a lot of speculation and questioning. Do most stars have planets? Or are planets very unusual? And nobody knew. But now we know that because we've discovered a lot of planets orbiting other stars nearby, it seems to be that most stars have planets. So the number of planets in the universe is comparable to the number of stars. Now, how many stars are there? And I should say that a fair fraction of the planets that have been discovered are habitable. I think it's a few percent. But it actually, as you'll see, it doesn't matter whether it's a few percent or 50% or 90%. That really doesn't matter so much, because there's an enormous number of stars and planets. So in a typical galaxy like ours, there's of order 100 billion stars. And the number of galaxies in what's called the observable universe, the part of the universe that we can see, is about 100 billion. So there are at least 100 billion galaxies, each of which has typically 100 billion stars. So you have 10 to the 22 power is the number of stars. And so the number of planets is of that order. It doesn't really matter if it's 10 to the 21 or 10 to the 23, that there's a lot. And that may actually be a drop in the bucket compared to the number that there actually are, because there are reasons to believe that the part of the universe we can see that is a very tiny fraction of the whole universe. So there might be exponentially greater number of planets out there than the 10 to the 22 that we think that are within range of within our observable universe. So there's a lot of planets, and therefore there are almost certainly a lot of habitable planets. But that raises the question of are any of them besides ours actually inhabited by life?
So if it's okay if I jump in here, now we've actually detected, and maybe it's not the right place to go into the modes of detection, but I understand it's actually complicated. It has something to do with the interruption of the orbit of the star based on the gravity of the planet or something like that. I think.
I mean, detected planets.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. I'm getting into exoplanets now.
Yeah.
So I've read that there's we've actually detected about 5,000 of them.
That's what I've heard. Yeah.
And so, I mean, do you know, or do you have a sense of how many of these are possible contenders to being Earth-like planets and therefore capable of sustaining life?
I seem to recall having heard that it's a few hundred out of those 5,000. Now things are constantly changing, so maybe it's more by now. I don't know. By the way, there's an excellent talk on the whole subject of exoplanets and the conditions for life And on the Society of Catholic Scientists website, because we had a wonderful talk at our 2021 conference by Karen Oberg. She's a member of our board. She's one of our members of the society, and she is a world expert on this subject, and gave a marvelous talk. So if you go to our website, go to conferences and look up the 2021 conference, you'll find your talk.
Great.
But as I said, there's a few hundred out of the 5,000, but that's a reasonable fraction, and so. We could talk a little bit about how they detect these planets if you want, but if you're talking about 10 to the 22 stars, and maybe 10 to the 22 or 10 to the 23 planets, it doesn't matter so much whether a few percent of them are habitable or 50% or 90%. You still have a gargantuan number of habitable planets.
Okay.
Right.
So then that leads us to the big question, which is, in your estimation, is there life? Generally, is it likely? Maybe you can't answer yes or no.
Yeah.
But then things must get incredibly more complicated to think about whether there's intelligent life. So your thoughts on the big question.
Okay. So this, as you say, there are two questions, maybe three. One is, how prevalent is life, which could be single-celled organisms. It could be bacteria or algae and things like that. Or then highly advanced intelligent life, let's say dogs and cats and ape-like, things like that.
Sure.
And then I would say there's a third question, which is, let's call it rational life, which is life like us, life which has reason and free will. And this would tie into the topics you want to talk about later, because that's another state. So there's life, there's, let's call it intelligent life, and then there's rational and free life. Let's call them rational life. There's a lot. I don't think anybody knows what the probabilities are, and I don't think they pretend to know. The scientists are as ignorant as the rest of us on this. You find scientists saying that if you have a habitable planet, it's very easy for life to appear,
to make the jump from inorganic to organic.
Jump from inanimate to a single-celled organism. Some people say that's easy. Scientists think that that's extremely difficult and extremely improbable. And similarly, in going from the single-celled organism to something as complicated as us, some people think, oh, once you get life going, evolution's just going to inevitably.
Well, wouldn't you? I guess it's hard to know when that jump to life would have taken place, but we have a universe that's around 14 billion years old, so that's plenty of time for evolution.
It's plenty of time. Well, this is the thing. So how long does it take? On Earth, again, it's not really known with 100% certainty, but there are people who say that there's evidence for single-celled organisms on Earth within a few 100 million years of the time that the Earth cooled down enough to make it habitable. And so the Earth has been around for, I think, 4.5 billion years. So if it only took a few 100 million years for the first life to appear, some people argue that that's evidence that it's easy. Right. That it's relatively easy. I actually think that's a dubious argument, and it gets technical, and I won't go into the details, but I actually don't think that's really a very good argument. That's the only argument that exists that it's easy to go from inanimate to animate, is that it happened quickly on Earth. Rather, it happened in a time short compared to the time it took us to appear. Now, how hard does it get from the first living thing, which is presumably a one-celled thing, to very complicated life? Again, there's a whole spectrum of opinions. Some people think that's extremely difficult, and some people think it's almost inevitable. And this is really in both cases, it's really guesswork, and with almost nothing to guide us. It did take on Earth, from the first living things to get to us, it took several billion years, which suggests it's hard. Even multi-celled organisms are relatively recent. For most of the history of life on Earth, it was single-celled organisms. So that suggests it might be difficult. But anyway, it's really something about which nothing is known. So the probability of getting life, that's advanced life, intelligent life, it could be extremely small. And this is where it gets into the question of whether it exists elsewhere in the universe. On the one hand, you have a vast number of habitable planets, presumably, let's say 10 to the 22 or something. On the other hand, the probability of on a randomly selected habitable planet, what are the odds of getting life and then getting highly advanced life? That could be 10 to the minus 100 as far as we know. Okay, or it could be 10 to the minus 10. It's presumably very small. But what you have is a very large number of planets and then a very small probability of it happening per planet. And to find out the average number of planets you expect, that how many planets you're likely to have life on, you multiply those two. And the thing is, you can get anything, because it's you have a very big number, and you don't really know how big it is, because, as I said, there could be a lot of planets outside our horizon. A very big number, you don't know how big, and a very small number, and you don't know how small, and you multiply them, you can get anything.
Right.
You can either get something very, so for example, suppose the probability of getting life is very intelligent. Let's suppose it's 10 to the minus 100 on any given habitable planet. Then the 10 to the 22 stars for planets is nothing.
Right.
10 to the 22 times 10 to the minus 100 is 10 to the minus 80. On the other hand, it could be the other way around. It could be that the probability is relatively large. And then I think actually what one can say is that either if there is intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, it probably is in enormous number of places. So it's either very, very hard to get it, and we may be the only ones by a fluke, or if it's not very unlikely, it probably is all over the place. Well, I shouldn't say it's in a vast number of places.
Right.
It's unlikely that there's just like two planets in the universe.
Right. Either the formula works out as such that you would have this occurring in many planets.
Yeah.
Or it's extremely unlikely.
It's extremely unlikely, which
by a fluke or otherwise it happened to. Okay.
Right.
So maybe it's a strange question, but I don't know, maybe it's not fair. So you could just take a pass if you want. But do you notice certain trends in the sorts of scientists who like to go for the life is out there in abundance, and others who would say, no, this is really unique?
No, I don't think, I don't know. I haven't really, see, that's not my field, so I don't read a ton of literature about it. So I think it probably doesn't divide on religious lines or philosophical lines.
Right, that's where I was going. Exactly.
Yeah. So I mean, I think you probably find people all over the map on this.
Yep. Okay, fair enough. So let's get a little bit into the religion and science angle on
But
this.
before we get to that,
okay,
you might how likely are we to encounter this life if it is out there? And this is something that I think a point that I think many people out in the general public are unaware of, and that is, even let's just suppose that there's other intelligent life in our galaxy.
Right.
The chance that it is existing at the same time we are, that is contemporary with us, is probably very small. And the reason for that is this: the universe, we appeared on the scene after about 14 billion years.
Yes.
Right? How long have we been here? Well, the human race, maybe 200,000 years, civilization, 5,000, industrial revolution, maybe 200 years ago. So advanced technological society has been only around. Now, how long will we last as an advanced technological society? Let's be really optimistic and say 1 million years. That's a lot, right? We might have depleted all our resources by then, or there've been an ice age, because there's going to be an ice age coming in 10 or 20,000 years. It's very likely could wipe out advanced technological civilization. But let's be really optimistic and say that such a civilization will typically last for 1 million years. That's a drop. That is a flash in the pan. That's just a blink of an eye in the history of the universe. 100 million years is one percent of history.
Yes, yes.
So if there's this other civilization
Might have been
in our
gone for
galaxy, it
hundreds of
might
millions
have
of years.
died out billions of years
Yes,
ago,
yes.
or it might not appear until a billion years from now. And the chance of us overlapping in time is probably tiny.
That's a really
So,
important point.
and so
Yeah.
that's why I don't believe that UFOs are aliens. Not because I think it's actually quite plausible that there's rational species out there.
Yes, yes.
Plausible, whether probable or not, nobody knows. But even if there is, the chances are that it is close enough. It would have to be in our galaxy, and that it's simultaneous with us is, I would say, utterly
So
negligible.
you just raised another question, because there's the point of simultaneity, but then there's also the point of travel.
And
How do you get
travel.
there? And
If,
presumably, I mean, who knows how
yeah,
long a
so we're
generation will be?
never going to travel intergalactic, okay? Because then you're talking about millions of years going at the speed of light. So even if you sent out somebody, they're not going to get back for millions of years,
Yes.
or tens of millions, or hundreds of millions of years. So that's forget about it. So any life that would be of interest as far as interacting with them would have to be in our galaxy. Now
Yes.
you're down not to 10 to the 22 planets, but 100 billion planets, which sounds like a lot, but it may not be. But you may be probably only talking about a small number of, if any, a relatively small number of planets with life like us.
And there's the distance problem still,
And
even if
then
we're
there's
from
the
this
distance.
galaxy,
So
because travel would be intergenerational.
yeah, to
wouldn't it?
go to the other side of our galaxy, that's 100,000 light years.
Mhm.
Nobody is going to, be going out and sending a message and getting one back 200,000 years later.
Yes.
No one's going to
Yes.
remember having sent the message. So you're
But
talking probably about just our little local area of maybe a few hundred light years at most. So the chances are there's no life on any of those planets. And even if it is, it probably is not simultaneous with us. So that's why I say I don't, I'm not interested in UFOs, because I think the chance that they're aliens, not because I don't think they're aliens, they could be aliens, but the chance that those UFOs are
around in our
aliens
neighborhood.
is, I would say, is so ridiculously small that it's not worth thinking about, in my
Well,
opinion.
okay, so I don't know if we need to get
Yeah,
into analysis of
right.
social phenomena, but nevertheless, people believe that UFOs are alien crafts, and I mean, it's a huge, huge pop phenomenon. I was listening to a podcast, which I won't name, in which there was a long interview, an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, with a scholar who was interested in questions of religion and science, and was just fully on board with alien visitations of Earth and speaking about different cases. We don't have to get into the details. But so I don't know, any thoughts on that? Like, why do people love to think they're UFOs are alien visitations?
I don't know. I mean, I'm interested in science fiction, and I'm interested in UFOs in a sort of mild way, like I am in the Loch Ness monster. I'm actually probably more interested in things like, the abominable snowman, or weird creatures that.
Sightings.
But I'm interested in a sort of like tabloid way of just gee whiz, what if, But I think a lot of people out there probably again, it's not a question of whether there's intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. I think that's quite plausible. It's a question of whether it's likely to have visited Earth, and there I think it's not at all plausible.
Yes.
I think most scientists would say it's probably not very plausible. But I think if you think it's plausible, then of course it becomes, then these UFOs become really, really important. If there's a real chance that they're aliens
Yes.
visiting us, then that's super important.
Yes.
But if it's utterly unlikely, then it's not important at
Well,
all.
then
And
it
so,
becomes, what's interesting is the pop phenomenon of
yeah,
all this interest. And so
yeah,
many of
and
the
I
stories seem to
wouldn't,
be, oh, there's some Russian pilot, Soviet pilot from the 70s who was flying and saw
yeah,
something. And I
you
mean,
know, as a, I don't put them down. I mean,
yes,
I just don't share their I just
yes,
I don't just share their view that these are likely to be
right,
extraterrestrial, but it's
right,
not a crazy view. But I
right.
just think
Okay,
it's
yeah,
yeah,
extremely unlikely. And then
extremely unlikely.
then there's the theological question, and on this channel, we do a lot of scripture talk, and so
Right.
theology comes up. And, we don't have to make reference specifically to Bible, Quran, but just thinking generally of
Yeah.
either the Jewish, Christian, or Islamic idea, which in many ways is common in the at least in the grand story of God and humanity.
Right.
That there is creation, that God created humans. People would explain this in different ways, but more or less to share his goodness and mercy with them, to receive their worship. And that humans, according to the traditional narratives of these three traditions, are precious and absolutely unique. Usually, most would say this. Certainly in regard to other non-human animals, in part because of a rational soul, but also because of the way in which God has revealed himself specifically and especially for humanity.
Right.
In the Christian story, of course, the incarnation is very important, is central, is more than very important. But even in Islam, for example, the notion that God has revealed himself through human prophets in order to appeal to the human mind to make a rational decision to worship him is central. And so humans are central and distinct. So how does everything change if they're actually not the only, I think you use the expression rational life, and there could be other rational lives, thinking theologically, perhaps endowed with a rational soul as well. Is that something that should disturb and trouble theologians? Like,
it does,
this
actually,
messes
though it
everything up.
shouldn't.
Okay.
It does. I've discovered that it does disturb some. I talk mostly to Catholic theologians because I'm a Catholic, but and I found that some of them are disturbed by the idea of other rational species, and I found that very few Catholic scientists are that I've talked to. But no, this is you set the table here perfectly. I mean, you've raised all the issues that I think are important. Yeah, so the Bible and the Quran, but the Bible is very anthropocentric. It's all about God and humanity, God and man. And it's about human salvation. It's a story of human, the fall, the creation, the fall of man, and our salvation. There's no hint of aliens in the Bible. So some people, as you say, it's very important that we are in some way unique. We are made only we are said to be made in the image of God. We are children of God. We are unique. We're not on the same plane as other living things. And so rational extraterrestrial life would seem to threaten that uniqueness. But I think it doesn't really. It's not, we're unique, not because we're the only such rational species necessarily. We're unique in the sense that there's something about us that makes us different from everything else on Earth, from plants and animals and even other sentient life on Earth. We have a spark of the divine. Let's say we are made in God's image. Now, that doesn't mean that God could not have created other beings in his image elsewhere in the universe. And the analogy I use is, if you are a person who loves trees, you might not just plant one tree, you might plant many trees. If you like flowers, you're likely not just to plant one flower, you're likely to plant many flowers. If God loves and cherishes rational creatures, why would he necessarily confine himself to making them only on Earth when there are all these other habitable planets? He might decide to plant a whole garden of them, that is, have lots of rational species.
Right.
Or to take another analogy, I loved my first child, but that didn't, and my wife and I didn't mean that we didn't want to have other children as well. And that doesn't mean we loved our first child any less, though little kids maybe sometimes are envious of their younger siblings and think that their parents they're not unique anymore. They have a little brother, a little sister, and they may feel threatened by that. But actually, the parent loves all the children equally. So it's not clear to me why God wouldn't create other rational species, which he loved just as much as he loves us. and they would also be made in the image of God, and they would also be his children, and he would also want to save them and to have communion with them. And so I don't see that there's a problem at all. The tricky part, it has to do with how they're redeemed, how they're saved, and the nature of God's relationship with them. It could happen, and I don't think any theologian would find, the Catholic theologian would find any difficulty in that God would send them prophets. That would be, that's not that what issues does that raise? And so certainly with those other beings, if they existed, God would reveal himself to them through prophets of their own species. But for Catholics, for Christians, and there's a special question, and that has to do, as you said, with the incarnation. Because Christians believe that God took the form, assumed the nature of these creatures, of us, shared our nature, without divesting himself of divinity, and dwelt among us, actually dwelt among us, as God in human vesture, so to speak.
And at least according to Orthodox teaching, only once, only in Jesus of Nazareth.
Only, well, yes, only on earth, only once. Now, now it's interesting. St. Thomas Aquinas actually asked himself the question. I don't know why. I'm very impressed by the fact that these medieval theologians really asked very fundamental questions that had no practical importance. Because as a physicist, we do the same thing. We ask very fundamental questions about nature that are not necessarily practical to get to the heart of things. And one of the things that St. Thomas asked himself was whether it was within God's power to have multiple incarnations. And he said, yes. He said that the Son of God, the eternal Word, the Son of God, could have become incarnate, had multiple human incarnations. Even but of course he didn't say that he did. He didn't, but it was within the divine power. There's nothing contradictory about it. And I think if that being the case, it would follow, and that God could have multiple incarnations as different rational species, and it would really, we could get into that. It may not be as of interest to your Muslim viewers, but I don't think that creates any theological problems.
Interesting. Yeah, I would think that aspect or element of the larger question of intelligent or rational life and beings with a rational soul is probably a little bit easier for Muslims to navigate, because the Islamic idea is that, okay, in fact, for most standard Muslims, although there's lots of diversity now, belief both in God and in Muhammad's messengership are necessary, at least to be assured salvation. But there were earlier dispensations of prophets before Muhammad. At that time, you didn't need to believe in Muhammad or, in fact, consider the Quran to be the word of God, because at least on earth, it didn't exist yet. So you could see very easily how a Muslim scientist, theologian could make the jump to say, well, there could have been other dispensations on other planets.
And there are Catholic theologians, there are Catholic theologians who'll say, oh, they have no problem, that God would save those other species simply through prophets, revelation through prophets, or that somehow Christ's sacrifice somehow saved everyone through the universe. I think that's certainly possible. So there are different possibilities. I don't think there's really any real problem for Christians. There is one added layer of question. Right. I've always thought that if we ever did, which I think the chances are infinitesimal, but if we ever did communicate with extraterrestrial rational species, one might find that they don't believe in God, so they might be atheists, or they might be theists. And if they're theists, they might have had prophets, in which case I would have said they were Jewish aliens, though maybe your listeners might say Muslim. I would say they were Jewish aliens because they had prophets, But if they believe in it, that God is a Trinity and that God took their form, then they would be Christian. And so we could quickly determine whether they were atheists, some other kind of monotheists, uh, Jewish, or Christian, by asking him certain questions like that.
Yes.
But
Yes.
it's I think kind of interesting.
Well, I think early in the conversation you suggested a segue to move on to questions of free
Yeah,
will and determinism, which is
right.
whether this is something distinctive of humans and sets them apart. And really, I think that's a big question. I mean, just from reading Modern Physics and Ancient Faith and some of your other writings, it seems to me that on this question of free will, the real sort of issue at the heart of the debate is, are humans more than machines, or is a human
Right.
is there something more than the physical brain? Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll try to set it up a little bit, but I probably won't do a very good job.
No.
I mean, you use the expression that in order to present the views of materialist atheist scientists, that humans are machines of meat from their perspective. So could you explain that a little bit, and
Yeah.
maybe just get us started with some of the challenges you've made to that idea?
Yeah. I think the greatest challenge to religion in our time and for a long time has been philosophical materialism, often called scientific materialism, which is the idea that there's nothing but matter. I mean, the only thing that exists ultimately is matter. And so, what are we? According to this view, we and all other living things, we are just complex physical systems. We're just a complex arrangement of atoms, and we are therefore essentially just very complex machines. Now, if we are and in particular, our minds are nothing but the workings of a very complex computer, a computer not made of silicon chips and things, but a computer made
Neurons.
of neurons and biological materials. And so I came across the expression that we are machines made of meat. It's been attributed to Marvin Minsky, who was a pioneer of artificial intelligence. Though I have tried on the internet to find out where and when he said this, and I can't. But somebody at least said that we're machines made of meat. And it's also been said that we are wet computers. So we're computers made of biological stuff. And that's all we are. And according to this materialist view. Now, if that is true, one of the things that it calls into question is whether we have free will. Because if something is purely physical, is just a material system, it would either its behavior, according to the way physicists look at the physical world, a physical system is going to operate. Its behavior is going to be a matter either of precise laws and some degree of randomness.
Yes.
In quantum mechanics. So
Yes.
The universe is based on the principles of quantum mechanics, and so there are precise laws. But these laws actually, what they generally give you is probabilities of things happening.
Mm-hmm.
And within those probabilities, what actually happens is simply a question of chance. So it's a combination
So
of
can I jump in?
Rigid laws and randomness.
Yeah, sorry, Steve, to jump in there, but I just wanted to emphasize that the quantum angle is a new wrinkle in the whole debate. I mean, you write, I have a quotation here that I noted from the book, page 176 of Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. You write, the issue of determinism and free will is one of the few where scientific theories have the potential of being in clear contradiction to religious doctrine. And such a contradiction really seemed to exist at the end of the 19th century. So I find that quotation is super interesting, in part because some might think of other things like cosmological questions or evolution and things, but you bring us to this question as a real possibility for conflict. Yes. Anyway, what changed
in fact,
from the end of the 19th century?
I jumped ahead. So let's forget quantum mechanics, which arose in the 20th century. Let's go back to before the year 1900. Let's go back to the time between Newton in the late 1600s and the year 1900. So there's 2 centuries. There, in that period of what's called classical physics, what you had is just the way the physical world seemed to operate is in accordance with rigid and exact universal mathematical laws. And these laws, all the laws that had been discovered up to that point, had one thing in common. They had a property called determinism. That is, they were so rigid that if you knew, hypothetically, if you knew the state of the physical world at one time, which no human could do, but let's say an angel knew the state of the physical world at one time, the entire future development of the world would uniquely follow from the equations. There'd be no wiggle room. Everything would be spelled out and uniquely unfold from those initial conditions.
Yes.
So how would we have free will? Because even supposing that we had spiritual souls and that I freely chose to extend my arm and pick up this cup of coffee, I wouldn't actually be able to carry that into effect, because what my arm actually does is determined by what was going on a billion years ago and the laws of physics. And so it's not up to me whether to extend my arm. The equations are going to determine that. And so how can I act freely? And that's a huge problem. And that was something that really, really worried intellectual, educated people for ever since the time of Newton. It actually led to a decline in Orthodox religious belief. It led to the rise of deism and certain sort of very watered down forms of in Europe of Christianity, in which we didn't have free will. In fact, in which God even didn't intervene in the world, because once God set the initial conditions of the universe, the laws of physics took over from there. And so God was sort of out of the picture. And so it led to these very watered down versions of religion and a lot of loss of faith. And this was actually, I've seen quotes and excerpts from what religious scientists were saying in the 19th century. And this was a big issue for them. I mean, how to combat this argument that against free will coming from physics. So that was a crisis. Now, I don't know that it reached everyday people, but ordinary people. But anyway, but the discussion changed a lot in the 20th century because with the advent of quantum mechanics, and now we know the laws of physics are not the way people thought they were. That the laws of physics are now obey some fundamental principles of quantum mechanics, according to which the laws don't tell you exactly what's going to happen. They only tell you the relative probabilities of various things happening. And that changes the terms of the debate a lot.
Right.
Now, the atheists would still say, now what the atheists or the materialists, let's say the people who deny free will on scientific grounds, what they would say is, okay, yeah, well, quantum mechanics means it's no longer all completely determined by the equations. But to the extent that it is not, it's just introduced an element of randomness into it. So the equations no longer tell you whether this radioactive nucleus, when it's going to decay. They only tell you a half-life, probability that it will decay in certain periods of time.
That's a good example.
But to the extent that it decays now rather than then at a particular time, that's just a probabilistic, that's a roll of the dice, governed indeed by probabilistic laws, but it's basically just chance. And that doesn't save free will, because if our actions, even if our actions were governed by a combination of rigid laws or equations and just chance, that's not freedom either.
Yes.
I mean, if what I'm going to do is just a matter of some random thing going on in my brain, that's not freedom. That's maybe insanity. I mean, if somebody's behavior was just utterly random, we would not say that person was even a reasonable person. We'd
exactly. But there's another component of quantum ideas, right? Which you get into in the book, which is that the observer actually has some sort of impact on what he or she is observing.
Yes. Well,
so does that change the equation or change the game somehow, or the terms
I think even before you get to that, I would argue that the fact that the laws are probabilistic, already changes
Okay.
the
Okay.
game, because it doesn't, because what it means is, suppose we have, as I believe, on philosophical and religious grounds, that we have a spiritual soul, and that means we have the power of free will. At least now there's the laws of physics aren't shackling that, aren't, that is, it's not, no Christian who is Orthodox, no Catholic would say that quantum mechanics or anything explains free will. What I would say is that it creates a space in which free will can operate.
Okay. That's a really
Because
good.
now, if I'm confronted with several choices, the laws of physics no longer single out one of them as the one that I inevitably must do. They still leave those open as possibilities, and any of them can happen without violating the laws of physics. And the laws of physics would assign probabilities to them, but that still allows me to come in with my free will and select one of them without violating the laws. And so it creates this opening. But as so I think it does actually, the anti-free will argument coming from physics, which is our choices are singled out for us by the laws, that's gone. I would argue, and many people would argue. And it allows us then real alternatives. We have real alternatives to choose from. And we can change, and in a sense, we can change the odds. So just because the laws of physics say the probability of A happening is such and such and B happening is such and such, that doesn't mean we can't choose. I mean, if I flip a coin, just from a purely physical point of view, there's a 50-50 chance of it coming up heads or tails. But I can take the coin and freely place it on the table and decide to make it a heads by just taking it and putting it heads up.
It's no longer 50-50.
Right. And so our will can intervene without, but the point is they don't have to violate. There's no law that says, no, it has to come up, it has to come out this way and this way only.
Okay.
Now, as you pointed to another aspect of quantum mechanics,
the role of the observer,
which is very important. There's a very powerful argument that goes all the way back to the foundations of quantum mechanics, to the effect, well, there's two arguments. One says that the observer, so in quantum mechanics, has a certain dual aspect to it. That is, in classical physics, all you talked about were physical systems governed by certain equations. But in quantum mechanics, the logical structures is a little more elaborate. In quantum mechanics, as traditionally understood, there are physical systems, and then there are observers. The physical systems are the things that you measure and calculate using your equations, but the observer is the one who makes the measurements.
Okay.
And so the observer has a special status. Now, there is an argument which would take too long to go into, take an hour, and I have a 40-minute YouTube video on this.
What is the title, just for viewers who
Well, I think it's like if they Google my name, Barr, or Stephen Barr, and quantum and observer, they'll come up with it.
Okay.
But I explain this traditional argument that the observers cannot be completely described by the equations of physics. The systems are, but if you try to stretch the equations to describe the observer in toto, completely, and say the observer is nothing but a physical system himself, then you run into problems. You run into paradoxes and sort of circularities that you can't get out of. It's called the measurement problem. And so there's an argument that goes back to the 1930s, and some very famous physicists have endorsed it, that the observer cannot be something entirely physical. Of course, we are physical, but we're not just physical. That's the argument. Now, in addition to that, and I think that's a powerful argument, and I think it's a serious problem for materialism. But beyond that, there are ways in which, in quantum mechanics, in a certain way, the observer, just by knowing the result of his measurement, it has been argued, changes or has an effect upon the physical world.
Yes.
So now, a lot of people don't like that. I should say anything about the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics is extremely controversial among physicists and among philosophers.
Okay.
But there are very interesting things. People can look up something called the quantum Zeno effect. Zeno is in Zeno's paradox, which is that it's called the quantum Zeno effect, and it's an example of how just the act of observing, the act of knowing what the result of an observation seems to affect the system. And so this almost this could be argued to be a way that mind can affect the material world.
Right.
There's a very interesting book, though not well. It's a book by a professor at Berkeley who's now in his 90s, Henry Stapp, and I think it's called Quantum Mechanics and Free Will, and he argues that on the basis of this, that the mind having an effect on matter in quantum mechanics, or arguably having an effect on matter, that he has a certain way of understanding how free will works. I mean, how is it? You see, it's a very interesting question. How is it that our free will, our free choices can affect the material world? I may decide in my spiritual soul, in my free will, to reach for that cup of coffee. But how does that act of will
play out?
How does it affect my arm?
Yes.
And how does it affect matter? That's a very deep question to which nobody knows the answer, but quantum mechanics may give us hints of something about along which lines we should look for the answer.
I really like the sobriety with which you caution the reader, or now the viewer, not to make the case that quantum mechanics actually wins the day or proves the case for those who may be theists and want to defend free will. Of course, not all theists do. So that's an interesting point. Maybe we can get into, or maybe that'll be for another talk, because I mean, in Islam as in Christianity, there are great classical debates between people who defend determinism and those who defend free will.
I would say for an Orthodox Christian, now there are strains of Christianity, maybe very extreme Calvinists who would say, even Calvinists generally believe that we have free will. They just think it's sort of been so weakened by sin that it hardly can operate. But for a Catholic, that humans have free will is a matter of faith. I mean, that is that's not something we're free to deny. I mean, that's something we could deny, but only by being heterodox.
You actually can
we can deny it. We're free to deny it, but in so doing, we're no longer
standing as a theologian.
We're no longer.
I mean, in
Orthodox.
Islam, without going into all the details, because that books and books have been written on it. There's this famous theological school that flourished for a few centuries, known as the Mu'tazila, who defended free will. And the more standard, at least Sunni, because the Shiite position is rather unique, but Sunni position accepts this sort of acquisition of God's ability to create acts. Acquisition is sort of the technical term that I'm translating from Arabic. And so it would probably lean towards determinism, but through that acquisition, there's some at least responsibility and culpability that's acquired. And of course, contemporary thinkers have many different views on this. So
maybe one thing I should interject here: there's two different determinism questions. There's the question of I think they're theologically quite different, and one is the question of whether the laws of physics and the state of the physical world determine our actions. Does the past uniquely determine the future? And that's usually called physical determinism. That, I think, is incompatible with our being able to act freely. There's also another determinism question: whether God knows the future, and does God knowing the future determine our actions? Now, I do not. I believe it's actually, again, it's Catholic dogma that God knows the future. So God knows from all eternity everything that's going to happen. That is de fide Catholic teaching, and I believe it. I do not think that it conflicts with free will. Now, many people say, I don't see how God can know the future and I'm still free to do something. They think that God knowing the future and our being able to act freely are incompatible. I don't think that is true. I think they're completely compatible. I don't think physical determinism is compatible with free will. But I think God's knowing the future is compatible.
Okay.
And I think Catholics have to believe both. God knows the future, and yet we are free. And I think that's important to raise that
Right.
question.
So we've touched on some of the problems for theists who acknowledge or believe in free will. But I want to touch on some of the problems for scientific determinists who want to uphold determinism.
Right.
One is more of a social observation, and it may not actually be determinative of, solve the debate or be convincing. But I mean, in fact, my sense is that most humans see themselves as sovereign, and actually societies operate that way, right? By holding people responsible for their actions, whether it's, sending my kid to his or her room, or, other consequences in the criminal system, et cetera, et cetera. So if in fact that's not the case, that humans are not freely making choices, I mean, it just seems to be an enormous tension between the way that individuals perceive things, the way society and families work, and the truth of things. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about that. So first of all, we definitely experience, I believe that our having free will, by free will, again, philosophers introduce different notions of free will. But there's a traditional notion of free will. Sometimes the philosophers call it libertarian free will. It's nothing to do with libertarianism, which means we actually can choose A or B. It is within our power to either make A happen or B happen. And that's the traditional kind of understanding of free will. Now, I think we know that we have such a power directly by exercising it. So I think that's an empirical fact. Now, what some atheists would say, some materialists would say, is that's an illusion. You think you have the power. What they would argue, and some of them have argued, the reason we think we have free will is that our actual decisions are being made at some subconscious level in our brains by mechanisms of which we are unaware. And our brains are making these decisions, and we don't know how it's happening. And so out come the decisions. And since we don't know what caused the decisions, namely all this chemistry in our brains, we invent this thing, this power of will as the cause. I don't really know why I did this. I really can't look into my brain and see why. Since I don't know why, I invent this power that caused it. And I call that free will. I don't think it is just that explains it. Because there are plenty of things my body does that I don't anticipate, and I really don't understand the mechanisms that caused it. Like my eyebrow could twitch, I mean, sometimes we get little twitches in our body, or little spasms or something, or impulses. Like suddenly I have an urge to do something. I don't know where that came from, and I suddenly want to have a bowl of ice cream, So these impulses, urges, and so on, we don't know where they came from, but no, we don't experience those as free. If my eyelid twitches, I don't say, "Oh, I freely did it." Or if I suddenly have an urge to do something, I don't. We actually experience a power of choice. I really, in the process, I really feel myself to have this power to do one thing or the other, and I take that seriously as an empirical fact. Now, as you said, suppose it's not true. Suppose we don't have free will. Suppose it's all being done by chemicals in our brains, and we really have no choice. Well, it's not just that. I actually think we could still punish people. It'd be perfectly logical to have laws and punishments, because you
for the future welfare society.
Well, not just that. I mean, because that would be like even a rat. I don't think a rat has free will, but you can give it incentives. You can, if the rat knows it's going to suffer some pain if it bites this piece of cheese, but it won't bite it, maybe. As you can train them by rewards and punishments. That's how they train rats to run mazes, with rewards and punishments, even though they have no free will. And you can train a computer. You tell if the computer knows it'll be checkmated, if it does this move, it'll do the other move. So, I mean, rewards and punishments can work even if there's no free will. What doesn't happen if there's no free will is blame, is somebody being blameworthy. And we all instinctively know that we don't blame something that doesn't have free will. we don't blame a little child of 2 for doing something because we know it doesn't know any better. We don't, and there are times I yell at my laptop or my television set or some piece of machinery that's not
Yes.
doing what I'm, but I know rationally that that's stupid of me. I don't really get it. I mean, I get angry,
Yes.
frustrated, but
Yes.
I'm not really angry at the laptop for not doing what I want or the machine. We don't get angry, we don't get indignant, we don't morally blame inanimate objects, we don't morally blame a tornado for knocking, destroying a house, we don't blame the COVID virus.
Mhm.
We might blame some jackass in the laboratory. If it was created by humans, we might blame the human. We don't blame the virus. And if we thought somebody was truly insane, had some sort of something wrong with his brain, or maybe under the influence of some powerful chemical or drug, we don't blame that person. And because we know they're not free, we do blame the fact that we do think certain people are worthy of blame or praise, shows that we actually think those people are free.
Yes. Yes.
And all morality, punishment, reward could still make sense, but morality would cease to make any
Yes.
sense.
Yes.
All our moral categories
It's really
would
interesting
simply
at a
lose
time.
all their meaning.
At a time when, I mean, it's probably not that new, in fact, but there's all this social messaging on different moral questions that we see in advertisements and politicians' speeches and slogans, all this about, what, at least what we experience in the West, and other cultures might be different, but, certain dispositions, certain attitudes, certain principles that are good and moral that we should all be sort of imbibing. And that's going on at the same time that in the scientific world, materialism seems to be orthodoxy. So that's actually a really interesting contrast.
It is. It's a disconnect not only in society but in individuals. So you might find a lot of scientists are religious, but you might find a hardcore sort of scientific atheist who says, "I don't believe there's free will." But that person might get very indignant in high moral dudgeon about something that he thinks is wrong.
Yes.
And now there's a disconnect in that person. I had a quasi debate with one of my colleagues. It was not really a debate. I was invited down to a university to give a 45-minute talk on science and faith, and then they had one of my colleagues, somebody I've known for many years, who's in my field of physics, who's an atheist, give a 10-minute response. And then at the end of that, the moderator asked each of us a hard question. And so the hard question they asked my atheist friend was, okay, they said, "You're a materialist, right?" He said, "Yes." "You think there's nothing but matter?" He said, "Yes." He said, "But do you believe there's objective right and wrong?" And he said, "Yes, I do." And so how do you square those two things? If everything's just matter, then how does right and wrong come into it? And he said, to be honest, I don't know how to put those together.
Conceded,
but I do believe there's right and wrong.
Yes.
And when you think about it, if there's nothing but a bunch of atoms and other particles moving around in response to forces, and it takes sort of stop looking at me as a person, look at me as just a bunch of atoms moving around in response to forces. And where does morality come in? I mean, Adolf Hitler is a bunch of atoms moving around in response to forces, and Mother Teresa is a bunch of atoms moving around in response to forces. And in either cases, the atoms are just doing what the equations say. How do you say this one is a moral person, this one is evil? How can you even say that what they're doing is right? We don't say that what a tornado is doing, or an earthquake is doing, a flood. We don't attribute say their moral attributes to that. And so, but we're just another physical phenomenon, then then all of moral language simply goes out the window.
Okay, last question. Thank you for bearing with me. So I want to speak about what actually, or what someone who believes in free will would say distinguishes humans from machines, or the human mind from a computer. And you speak about understanding in your book, that understanding is different from knowledge. Maybe I'm not getting the right terms. You can correct me on that. And you make the point that it's not just the complexity of the human brain and the huge number of neurons that work together, which in fact make it more complicated. You wrote this in 2003, but probably still in 2022, make it more complicated than computers. But it's a certain capacity to understand things. So
correct.
did I sum that up right, or could you correct me?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, I give a number of arguments. Traditionally in Christian thought, going back to the earliest days of the church, the powers of the human being that were regarded as sort of preeminently are the spiritual powers in us were reason and free will. Now, some people say, what about love? Well, love is important, but love is actually comes from our free will. To love someone. The traditional understanding is to freely will the good of that person. Yeah. So it's an act of free will. If it's not free, it's not love. So that's free. Love is something that stems from our rationality and freedom. Now, can a machine be rational and free? Well, I don't think a machine can be free because a machine, if I define a machine as something that's simply following the laws of physics with the built-in randomness of quantum mechanics, that freedom doesn't come out of that. But I think also rationality does. Now, a lot of people might dispute that and say, well, machines can be pretty smart. Well, granted, my laptop or my chess playing program on my phone, which I spend, my free moments playing chess with my phone. Yeah, admittedly, it doesn't have free will, but it does. It's pretty smart. Like it beats me sometimes in chess, and that shows it's smart. No, it doesn't, because it's purely calculation. Chess is a finite game. And in theory, not in practice, you could actually have a gigantic book. It would be bigger than the universe, but you could have a gigantic book in which you could look up any chess position and it would tell you the right move to make. And that's not thinking. A book is not intelligent. And so the machine is just, the chess playing program is just grinding out a calculation. It's doing nothing more ultimately than adding and subtracting numbers. It's no more intelligent than a machine that would sort of do long division or something.
Yes.
Or a human being who's mechanically doing long division by the procedure he's been taught. You could be thinking about what you're going to have for dinner tonight. You could just sort of mindlessly do long division. The machine is not understanding anything conceptually. And that's what sets us apart. The machine can do the computations. It can manipulate symbols, because what the machine does, a computer, for example, it's manipulating symbols. And the symbols you can think of as zeros and ones, bits, but it's basically manipulating little symbols. But we understand the meanings of symbols, and that's something completely different. So a machine could be trained to do algebra. It could take the symbols like A times B plus C equals A times B plus A times C. There's just a lot of symbolic manipulation.
Yes.
And a machine can do those, but it doesn't know the meaning of the symbols. Just like Google Translate or one of these translating programs. It doesn't understand what it's translating. It's taking a set of symbols which represent some passage of English prose, and it uses some algorithms, some formulas and rules to turn them into another set of symbols, which are the same passage in French. But it doesn't understand the meaning of any of the symbols.
It's not going to reflect on the meaning of that.
Right. It could take pencil in English and turn it into karandash in Russian. That's what I studied in high school. But it doesn't know that those symbols stand for pencil.
Yes.
It's just manipulating.
I think you make the point in the book that even 2 plus 2, a machine will calculate it, but won't understand it. Or even the number 2, what 2 means.
What 2 means.
It won't understand. So
we actually can understand. So we can understand the symbols and the way things are put together. And so, for example, you can have an adding machine that can add numbers, we can know the same rules the adding machine is using, but if you ask the adding machine, can you add two even numbers and get an odd number? Well, the adding machine doesn't know the answer. Of course, if you give it any two even numbers, it will add them and get an even number.
Yes.
But it doesn't understand the meaning. Whereas we can look at the rules of addition, and we can not just use them to add numbers, but we can look at them and say, aha, I see, I understand what's going on here. And I can see that no matter what two even numbers you put in there, you're always going to get an even number. You're never going to get an odd number. So you see, the understanding allows you to make inferences and draw conclusions that just
really
rigidly following the rules doesn't allow you to do.
Yes.
And so humans operate on the conceptual level that also animals don't have. Animals know. When I had a dog, died, but the dog knows that there's an animal. You know, it chases the squirrel. In some level, it knows it's a squirrel and it's not a tree. It knows that that's its dinner bowl. It knows, but it's not rational knowledge. The dog cannot say, that is a bird sitting in a tree. It doesn't have propositions. It cannot say, here's a proposition. I understand the proposition, and I say that, affirm that it's true. It doesn't operate on the rational and conceptual level. And so only humans on Earth do that. And neither animals nor machines have conceptual understanding and abstract thought.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. And that last note at the end brings us full circle back to the first part of our discussion. So that's brilliant. I'm very
but maybe some aliens do.
Maybe some aliens do. Yes.
But I should say one last thing.
Okay.
If there are aliens out there who have rational minds and free will, and that's conceptual understanding and so forth, their spiritual souls were created by God. And so they weren't just the products of material forces, of evolutionary processes. If they're rational and free, and therefore spiritual souls, their spiritual souls are directly created by God, we would believe.
This was a great conversation.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Yeah.
Well, friends, thanks for being with us for this episode of Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I hope you found it to be an edifying discussion. I really hope that you find generally the content on this channel to be useful. There's a really diverse range of things in regard to Quranic studies and biblical studies with top-notch scholars. And we'll be really grateful for your support. So please don't hesitate to like the videos, starting with this one maybe, to subscribe to the channel and to share the news with your friends about exploring the Quran and the Bible.